The Panasonic GH3 was released back in 2013. Now, at the time, it cost around $1,300. Nowadays, you can find it used for about $350. The Panasonic GX85 was released back in 2016. Now, at the time, it cost about $800, but nowadays currently sells used for about $350, which kind of begs the question, which one of these is right for you? Now, I've already done full reviews of both of these cameras. I'll have those linked below. This video is more to just sort of help you understand kind of the similarities and differences of these cameras and help you kind of figure out which one actually works best for your needs. Now, in terms of video, both cameras actually have a pretty good looking image, but the GH3 is admittedly a little bit older and it doesn't do 4K. Got 1080p at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second. Now, on the Panasonic GX85, it's a bit more modern, so you've got 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. Although I would say for those of you guys that are sort of nerds like me when it comes to like codecs and bit rates, the GX85's 4K is just MP4, and it's cropped at that. And then when you add image stabilization, it's cropped in even that much more. Whereas on the GH3, 1080p is all intra. You know, you've got this really good codec at 77 megabits per second, and I think like it does have kind of a special look to it. However, in terms of actual video features, I'd argue that the GH3 is obviously more video-centric, whereas the GX85 is more photography-centric. GH3 actually has a fully articulating screen, a mic input, and even a headphone jack for monitoring your audio. The GX85, on the other hand, the screen doesn't articulate, it just kind of tilts down and tilts up, and there's no mic input whatsoever. But you know, having said that, the GH3 doesn't really have any kind of image stabilization. You're just relying on whatever image stabilization the lens has. The GX85, on the other hand, actually has pretty amazing image stabilization. I mean, in the time that I've had this camera, I've been filming so much stuff with my Olympus 45mm f1.8 lens. That's a 90mm equivalent, and I'm able to film all of this stuff just handheld without any problems. You know, when I try the same thing with the GH3, it becomes very noticeable right away that the GH3 doesn't have any stabilization. In terms of photography, both cameras are kind of dealing with a similar sensor. I mean, the GH3, you've got a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor, and the GX85, you also have a 16 megapixel micro four thirds sensor. Especially if you're into like street photography and stuff like that, like GX85 paired with like an Olympus 17mm f1.8 or a Leica 25mm f1.4 would make a pretty cool combination. I'd say while both cameras are very capable for photography, I'd kind of lean more towards the GX85. Now, of course, with any Panasonic review, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is autofocus. Both of these cameras, unfortunately, use an old-fashioned contrast detect autofocus, but at least the Panasonic GX85 has a more updated version with Panasonic's depth from defocus technology. If you're not actually familiar with depth from defocus, it's basically a complex algorithm that calculates the distance between the foreground and the subject in the background, and then it just kind of ignores the subject and focuses on the background. I mean, look, I'm not here to bash Panasonic. I'm a longtime user of Panasonic cameras, but it's something everyone's aware of, you know, and that's the thing. A lot of you guys watching this probably already are Panasonic users, and you're used to the autofocus at this point. You've found ways to work around it and like get the shots that you need, or you're probably just like filmmaker types and you only focus manually anyway, so you don't even care about autofocus. I am just saying this, however, though, in case anyone from any other camera system is curious about these cameras. Like, you know, if you're a Canon user or a Sony user or a Nikon user, an Olympus user, you have a DJI Osmo Pocket or like some GoPros or a Potato, maybe. If you use any other camera in existence today, you will be absolutely mortified when you see just how bad the autofocus is on these cameras. And again, you know, I'm not bashing it. I mean, I'm just saying it out of frustration. As someone who loves Panasonic and who owns 5 different Panasonic cameras myself, I'm a fan of the company. It's just the autofocus is a weakness that you have to be aware of. In terms of bonus features, both cameras have features that sound kind of gimmicky on paper, but actually kind of work really well in real life. For example, the GH3 has what they call a variable frame rate option. It's basically just in-camera slow motion. If you're filming in a 24 frames per second timeline, it films at 60 frames per second and then slows it down by 40%, giving you a nice slow motion file. And same goes if you're filming in 30 frames per second, it slows it down by 50%. Slow motion files from the GH3 actually look really nice and really smooth. One thing I will note though is these files don't have audio. I have my custom buttons set to be my slow motion settings. There have been so many times where I didn't realize I was in that setting and I recorded a whole talking bit like this, only to realize later that it's just this slow motion version of me talking without any sound or anything. I had to just go back and reshoot the bit. That's something that's definitely worth noting. The GX85 has what's called 4K live cropping. It's basically in-camera keyframes. It allows you to set a point, say, the full width of the sensor, and then set another point at, say, the center of the sensor, and it slowly transitions in. It looks like you're actually zooming in. It sounds like something that wouldn't be that big of a deal, but I actually use it all the time because it kind of mimics the look of a slider without actually having a slider. There's so many times for product shots where I set the start point at the left side of the frame and the end point at the right side of the frame. The camera just slowly pans across the sensor and it gives the illusion of actually panning with a slider. You know, it sounds kind of funny, but like, I actually use it all the time. You know, take for example this video here. This was a whiskey commercial that I shot, and then I ended up not actually posting it to YouTube because I just wasn't crazy with how the video itself was coming out. But if you look at this intro here, these shots where it's like zooming into the spinning bottle, there's no actual movement in that scene. That's actually just the camera doing 4K live cropping. So ultimately, which one is actually right for you? Well, I think photographers are probably going to lean more towards the GX85. You know, that rangefinder style body just has street photography written all over it. And I think, you know, more serious filmmakers will probably lean towards the GH3, but ultimately each camera kind of has what the other camera needs. You know, the GH3 is probably the better bet for video, but it doesn't have 4K and it doesn't have that image stabilization that the GX85 has. GX85 is like great at video, but it doesn't have that articulating screen and that mic input. So that's kind of like a big part of your decision right there is how much are those things important to you? How much do you actually need an articulating screen? If you're behind the camera all the time, probably don't need it at all. Mic input, on the other hand, you probably will need that if you're serious about video. Now, on the other hand, if you're more photo all the way and you don't care about those things, well, it's just not an issue. You know, but ultimately there are a lot of great cameras in this $350 price range. I mean, as always, I cite the Canon M6 that I filmed these videos with. Also Sony a6000, I film with that a lot. I just kind of wanted to make this quick little comparison because I realized based on the other two videos, the separate reviews I did of these cameras, there was actually kind of like a big interest in these two. And so I thought this might actually come up at some point for someone who's just super into Panasonic, super into Micro Four Thirds. Anyway, I think that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.